The pale fingers of dawn crept over the jagged skyline of Crystal Peak, turning shadowed granite into soft rose and gold. Ethan tightened the straps on his well-worn backpack, feeling the reassuring weight of his climbing gear, ice axe, crampons, rope against his back. Beside him, Kota's sable coat glinted like burnished bronze in the newborn light. The shepherd mix's ears twitched, his keen nose tracing the crisp scent of morning air, and he let out a single, breathy bark that sounded almost like a greeting to the waking world. Ethan had known this moment for months. He'd studied topographical maps by lamplight, memorized avalanche risk charts, and conditioned his body to the thin air of high altitudes. Yet nothing had prepared him for the hush that fell over the forest at the edge of the tree line. Here, ancient pines stood sentinel, their boughs heavy with frost, and the underbrush lay buried beneath a fresh blanket of powder. Each step crackled softly, as though the earth itself whispered in warning. They began their ascent along a narrow trail carved into the mountainside, a series of tight switchbacks that climbed steadily toward the timberline. Kota moved ahead, paws sure on ice-slick rock, then circled back to glance up at Ethan, tail wagging in muted encouragement. Ethan responded with a grateful smile and a pat on the dog's broad head. He'd adopted Kota 2 years earlier when the dog was a runt abandoned on a rain-soaked trail. Since then, they'd forged an unbreakable bond, Ethan, the planner, reader of maps and forecasts, Kota, the instinctive guardian, ever alert to the forest's hidden currents. At 8,000 feet, the forest began to thin. Stunted larches, needles gilded by frost, gave way to windswept clearings dotted with the bleached skeletons of fallen trees. The sun climbed higher, and shafts of light pierced pockets of mist, illuminating ancient cairns that marked the way for generations of climbers. Ethan paused at one such marker, a stack of stones draped with prayer flags, their colors faded by sun and storm. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and thought of the promise he'd made to test his limits, to chase the summit's silent grandeur, and to rely wholly on Kota's uncanny sense for danger. Pushing onward, they entered the mountain's more austere domain. The air grew thinner with each step, and Ethan felt the sharp tug of altitude at his lungs. He paused again, crouching to secure his crampons before tackling the steeper icefields that lay ahead. Kota sat patiently at the trail's edge, whiskers dusted with frost, watching Ethan's careful preparations as if to say, "I'm ready when you are." Together they embarked onto the glacial slope, the world narrowing into the narrow beam of Ethan's headlamp and the rhythmic rasp of ice against steel. The wind, once a gentle murmur, now moaned through rock crevices, carrying a warning of unseen shifts in the snowpack above. High on the couloir's lip, pale cornices gleamed, beautiful, undulating cliffs of snow that, in the wrong moment, could release their deadly weight. Ethan swallowed hard, his heart quickening with both excitement and a flicker of apprehension. He glanced down at Kota, whose dark eyes met his with unshakable confidence. In that instant, Ethan knew no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. With a final deep breath, he drove his ice axe into the ice and began the steep climb into the high country, each measured swing a testament to trust, preparation, and the unspoken vow between man and dog. Mid-morning, the sun had climbed high enough to turn the horizon a brilliant sapphire, yet the air on the mountain still held a biting chill. Ethan paused on a gently sloping ledge, brushing a fresh layer of snow from his GPS and altimeter to confirm their position at 10,200 feet. He wiped his breath from the device and traced the next segment of the route, a steep, narrow couloir that would take them toward the final ridge. Beside him, Kota's ears twitched at the slightest shift in the wind. The dog lifted his muzzle, inhaled deeply, then let out a low, deliberate growl. Ethan followed Kota's gaze to the broad slope above. A thin veneer of new snow lay on top of a denser, older layer, a classic setup for a slab avalanche. He crouched to press his ski pole into the surface. The pole sank deeply with almost no resistance. "That's not good," Ethan muttered. Retrieving his avalanche probe, he jabbed it into the snow every few feet, mapping out soft pockets where the layers decoupled. Each hollow result set off a ping of alarm in his mind. He closed his eyes, recalling his training. Collapsing whomp sounds, sudden cracking, and steep slopes were a recipe for disaster. Kota paced anxiously along the edge of the ledge, tail tucked low. The dog's body language told Ethan what his instruments already confirmed: the snowpack was unstable. A distant, hollow boom echoed off the granite walls, a tongue of avalanche debris shearing free higher up. Ethan grabbed Kota's harness and drew him close. "Okay, buddy," he said, voice tight with concern. "We're heading down." He exchanged a quick look with his reflection in Koda's dark, trusting eyes, then began a careful descent. Rather than retracing their ascent path, Ethan chose a sheltered gully shaded by a rock buttress, terrain he hoped would deflect any loose snow. Koda followed silently, paws sure on the firm, compacted trail. With each measured step, Ethan probed the snow ahead with his pole, testing for hidden voids that could swallow them without warning. High above, the cornice overhung like a frozen wave, sunlight had begun to soften its base. Ethan imagined the moment it might break, a sudden, catastrophic fall, yet he forced himself to focus on the here and now. Halfway down, a sharp crack split the air. Snow peeled from the couloir's edge, forming a thin, cascading veil that thundered toward them. Ethan's heart pounded as he grabbed Koda and sprinted for the buttress's lee side. The mini avalanche roared past within yards, carving a trench through the fresh powder but leaving them unscathed. Snow dusted their backs, and in the sudden silence afterward, Koda pressed his shoulder against Ethan's leg as if to say, "See? We made it." Breathing hard, Ethan pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the rapid beat beneath. The mountain had given its warning. Koda licked Ethan's glove, an instinctive gesture of reassurance. Together they stood in the shelter of the rock, snow swirling in eddies around them, contemplating their next move. The summit still beckoned, but now their goal had shifted, survival first, ambition second. As they prepared to navigate back towards safer ground, Ethan knew this climb would demand more than physical strength. It would require patience, caution, and absolute trust in Koda's unerring instincts. A sudden, bone-shaking crack echoed through the icy air, ripping the fragile calm to shreds. In an instant, the pristine snowfield above Ethan and Koda fractured like glass under an invisible hammer. Thousands of tons of snow and ice sheared loose from the lip of the couloir, cascading down the mountainside in a deafening wall of white. Ethan scarcely had time to register the sound before the avalanche bore down upon them like a freight train of frozen fury. "Down," he shouted, voice lost in the roar. Instinctively, he flung himself toward the jagged outcrop of granite beside him, grabbing its bitterly cold surface with gloved fingers. Koda, muscles coiled, lunged to the side, pressing his flank against Ethan's hip as the torrent slammed past. The impact hit them with such force that the mountain seemed to shudder. Sheets of snow whistled past in a blur, carrying broken branches and plumes of ice crystals that stung the skin like slivers of glass. Ethan curled into himself, eyes squeezed shut against the blinding flood. The avalanche's roar reverberated through his bones, each tremor a monstrous heartbeat. His chest stung as snow packed around him, making each breath a labor. Somewhere above the tumult, a spray of pine needles rattled in the wind, and Ethan wondered if the ancient trees would survive this onslaught. Moments, though he would later swear they felt like lifetimes, passed in white blur agony. Then the thunderous rumble began to fade, retreating upward as the avalanche spent its fury and ground to a hiss among the boulders below. Ethan dared to open one eye, peering through the swirling haze. The world had transformed into a surreal landscape of smoldering snowdrifts and jagged ice debris. He could still hear the distant creak of settling pines and the gentle patter of residual snowfall. "Koda," he rasped, voice hoarse. Panic clawed at his chest. He fumbled for his headlamp, brushing snow from its lens and clicking it on. Its narrow beam carved through the milky air, catching a dark shape slinking toward him, fur-dusted white, tail wagging in relief. Koda skidded to a stop at Ethan's side, barking in short, excited bursts as if checking that his friend was truly alive. Ethan pressed a trembling hand to the dog's muzzle. "Thank you," he whispered, swallowing against his parched throat. The warmth of Koda's body, even through layers of snow and fur, was more comforting than any down jacket. Grateful tears mixed with frozen droplets on Ethan's cheeks. Bathed in the aftermath, Ethan pushed himself upright on unsteady legs. His limbs felt leaden, weighted by the chill, but adrenaline lent him strength. He scanned the ground ahead. The refuge of the rock overhang provided scant shelter, but beyond it lay a narrow gully that might lead them out of the avalanche's debris field. "Come on, boy," Ethan urged, voice steadier now. "Let's get out of here." Koda barked again and led the way, nose low to the ground, tracing the least resisted path through the frozen rubble. Together they picked their line, stepping over shattered ice shelves and around half-buried boulders. Each stride was a careful negotiation. One misstep could plunge them into a hidden crevasse or a pocket of deceptively soft snow that would swallow them whole. As they moved, Ethan's mind raced through checklists: hypothermia, frostbite, getting shelter, aiding his dog if injured. But every time doubt crept in, he glanced down at Koda's determined trot and felt his own resolve harden. The dog's unspoken faith was the compass that drove Ethan forward. Halfway through the debris, a sudden shift in the air temperature warned of another possible slide. Ethan froze, peering up at the slope's fractured lip where the wind had hollowed thin layers of frozen snow. Koda, ever vigilant, let out a low growl. Together they crouched behind a fallen pine trunk, its roots torn like snapped cables from the avalanche's force. Ethan waited, listening to the mountain's muted sobs, dripping water from melting ice, the distant groan of stressed rock, until the moment of greatest peril passed without further incident. In that lull, the first soft flakes of new snow drifted down to cloak the devastation in a deceptive hush. Ethan exhaled, sounding louder than intended in the stillness. "We made it," he murmured. Koda pressed against his side again, as if to echo the sentiment. Carefully, they resumed their trek through the churned rubble. The avalanche's path narrowed as they descended into a shadowed cleft, where a ribbon of unfrozen ground glimmered. Koda sniffed eagerly, guiding Ethan toward what looked like the route they had scouted before the slide. Ethan's shoulders straightened. Ahead lay their only route to shelter, the battered hut he had programmed into his GPS. Behind them, the mountain's jagged contours glowed now with the pale afternoon sun, as if unconcerned by the havoc it had just wreaked. But for Ethan and Koda, the mountain's fury was a stark teacher, one that hammered home the frailty of human ambition and the paramount importance of trust in the bond between man and dog, and trust that, together, they could weather the wild's most devastating tantrum and emerge alive on the other side. When the avalanche's roar faded into distant echoes, the sky overhead had already grown heavy with steel-gray clouds. Ethan and Koda stood amid the churned rubble, the first icy needles of a gathering storm stinging their faces. Ethan's teeth clenched against the cold as he checked his GPS one-handed. The emergency shelter hut lay just beyond a final ridge, barely half a mile ahead. He glanced down at Koda, fur crusted with snow, proud stance unbroken, and felt a surge of determination. There was no time to lose. Hypothermia would strike quickly once the wind rose, and nighttime temperatures here could kill in minutes. They set off at a staggered run, crampons biting into the uneven drift. Wind gusts swept up powdery clouds around them, reducing visibility to mere yards, and each breath tasted of frozen dust. Koda moved with uncanny surety ahead of Ethan, pausing at every turn to ensure the path held firm ground. Twice Ethan plunged thigh-deep into concealed snow hollows, cursing under his breath until Koda's plaintive bark guided him back onto solid footing. The oppressive roar of the wind made dialogue impossible. Instead, each man and dog relied on practiced gestures, constantly checking their pace, trusting the unspoken bond that had guided them thus far. At last, through the howling haze, a dark rectangle materialized against the white expanse, the shelter hut's weather-beaten door and frosted window framed by a crust of ice. Ethan's heart surged with relief and fresh urgency. He sprinted the last dozen yards, snow spraying behind him, and pounded on the door's frozen planks. Koda barked insistently, nose pressed against the lower edge, searching for an entry point. Ethan fumbled for his ice axe, its shaft slick with frost, and began hacking at the drift blocking the threshold. Each swing sent shards of ice clattering into the wind, and with one final crack, the door shuddered open just wide enough for them to slip inside. The shelter's interior was a cramped, single room of rough-hewn timber, its walls hung with outdated route maps and survival instructions. A small wood stove stood in the center, its cold metal grate half buried in ash. Ethan collapsed onto a wooden bench, wrestling off his gloves, boots, and frost-laden jacket while Koda shook himself, sending a flurry of snow inward. The storm's howl was instantly muffled once the door creaked shut behind them. For the first time in hours, they were sheltered from the white fury outside. Ethan knelt by the stove and coaxed it to life, blowing gently on a wisp of tinder until a flicker of flame blossomed into steady warmth. He tucked Koda under his arm and pulled a collapsed space blanket from his pack, wrapping them both in its shimmering layers. Steam rose from a small pot of rehydrating soup as its salty scent filled the air, soothing their frayed nerves. Koda gazed up at him with wide, trust-filled eyes. Ethan ran a hand through the dog's matted fur. In the fragile glow of the hearth, Ethan whispered, "We made it this far, buddy. Now we rest, and then we head home." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside this tiny refuge, the bond between man and dog burned brighter than any tempest. Long before the first pale streaks of dawn touched the horizon, Ethan stirred beneath the makeshift insulation of the emergency shelter. The storm outside had waned to a whispering flutter, and the only sound within the cramped wooden walls was the soft, rhythmic rise and fall of Koda's gentle breaths. Ethan pushed aside the frost-laced door flap and peered out. A crisp, pale light illuminated the world beyond, transforming the battered snowfield into a hushed landscape of soft grays and muted blues. With deliberate care, Ethan rekindled the stove's embers. He coaxed the small flame back to life, watching the flicker of orange warmth dance across the soot-streaked ceiling. The comforting hiss of melting snow in the kettle was the first true sign of renewal. Koda, roused by the stirring light, patted over and nuzzled Ethan's hand, his dark eyes reflecting the fragile hope of a new day. Together, they shared a quiet meal of rehydrated porridge and sipped hot broth, savoring each spoonful as though it were a gift. Ethan unzipped his parka and lay a gentle hand on Koda's flank. "All right, boy," he murmured, voice thick with emotion, "time to head back." Outside, the air was cold but calm, the biting wind of the previous day replaced by a stillness that felt almost sacred. Ethan tightened his gaiters and refastened his pack, running a brisk hand through Koda's snowdust coat before clipping on the leash. They stepped into the pale dawn together, their tracks the first to mar the freshly fallen snow. The descent from shelter to base camp was both arduous and reassuring. As they navigated the ridge that had once threatened to bury them, Ethan relied on Koda's unwavering confidence. The dog's nose quivered as he sniffed hidden paths, seeking the firm ground beneath. Every footprint they left was a testament to their survival, every careful step a step closer to home. The ruined gully where the avalanche had raged now lay silent, its scarred surface smoothed by overnight dusting. Ethan paused at its lip, resting a hand on a frost-coated boulder, and offered a silent tribute to the mountain's might and its mercy. By mid-morning, they slipped beneath the sheltering canopy of pines, where broken branches still lay heavy with ice. A soft chorus of returning birdsong greeted them, shy and tentative, as though nature itself was celebrating their safe return. Koda bounded ahead, then circled back to encourage Ethan onward. The final stretch led them down a narrow creek bed, now free of dangerous drifts, toward the distant glow of Basecamp's fire. Smoke curled upward in gentle spirals, and Ethan's heart leapt. He raised his ice axe in greeting. Koda's triumphant bark echoed across the trees. Figures appeared among the tents, guides, friends, and fellow climbers, bundled in parkas and leaning on shovels, alert eyes scanning the tree-line. One by one, they rushed forward, their faces a blend of relief, joy, and amazement at the sight of Ethan and his steadfast companion emerging from the winter gloom. Ethan broke into a jog, laughter and tears mingling as he drew nearer. He dropped to one knee, sweeping Koda into a tight embrace. The dog's fur prickled against Ethan's cheek, warm and alive. Around them, rescuers and allies formed a circle, enveloping them in coats and blankets, offering hot drinks and steady hands. "You did it," one guide said, his voice thick with emotion. "You both did it." The campfire crackled, sending sparks into the clear air, each one a tiny star born from human kindness and canine loyalty. Later, as the sun rose higher, bathing the encampment in a soft, golden glow, Ethan sat by the fire, Koda curled at his feet. He reflected on the ordeal, the thunderous avalanche, the desperate scramble through drifted snow, the fragile shelter that had stood between life and death. But most of all, he thought of the unspoken bond between man and dog, the silent trust that had carried them through the mountain's fiercest fury. When questions came, how they had chosen their path, when danger had first struck, how Koda had sensed each hidden threat, Ethan found himself smiling. "I didn't guide him," he said softly, looking down at the shepherd Nix whose ears twitched at every flicker of light. "He guided me." Around him, listeners nodded, understanding in their eyes that true leadership springs not from ego, but from the humility to follow another's strengths when our own falter. By midday, a humble celebration had taken root, mugs of steaming cocoa, stories traded of close calls and unlikely miracles, and the warm embrace of a community bound by respect for the mountain's power. As Ethan and Koda prepared to depart the next morning, the mountain's ridges behind them glowed in the afternoon sun, no longer menacing but majestic, an endless expanse that tested the limits of the human spirit and spotlighted the fierce resilience of a loyal companion. In the end, Ethan understood that the summit he had truly conquered was not the peak of Crystal Peak, but the summit of trust, courage, and unwavering companionship. And as he and Koda descended the final slopes toward home, they carried with them a story of survival that would echo through every Pinedale and high country meadow, a tale of a man and his dog, whose rush of rescue became a testament to the enduring power of hope.